All right. Hey, welcome. I got the post-lunch envious slot. So I'm Dr. Mark Peters. I'm here to talk about managing team value. But we have to make sure everybody's awake after lunch, so I'm going to have to tell a joke. And it should be inoffensive. If it is offensive and you find it offensive, please come tell me. I'm happy to take all feedback. But we're back here in Michigan, and it's actually bow season for deer. It's not rifle season right now, but it's bow season, as the people I'm staying with inform me, as they've gone out every morning to look for deer. But in this case, we have the hunter who heads up north. He's going to find deer. He takes his rifle with him. Like all hunters who head up north, he has a couple drinks. He might not be in a good position to go hunting, but he's going to hunt anyways. He hears some rustling off in the bushes. So he aims his rifle and he fires. He goes to look for the deer. Unfortunately, it's not a deer. He's winged a bear. The bear is less than friendly about the fact that he's winged the bear. It gets very offensive, starts chasing him. He shoots at the bear again. He misses because he's imbibed too many beverages. So he starts running away from the bear uphill, because uphill is the best way to escape bears. As he's running uphill, he trips over a root and hears his ankle snap. Goes down to the ground. Bear's standing over him. He throws the rifle at the bear. Bear bats the rifle out of the air. So now he's got no options left, right? So he says, Lord, I know I haven't been a good man. I haven't gone to church. I haven't done all the things I'm supposed to do. But if there's anything you could do for me, anything at all at this point, please, please make this bear a Christian. The clouds part. Beam of light comes down out of the sky and hits the bear. And the bear stops, sinks to its knees, puts its paws together and says, Lord, bless this food that we're about to receive. So the connection is, in managing team value, you got to know what you're getting. And the question I ask in starting to do this research, because this is a research-focused talk, is how do we deal with function security? The program manager runs in, he says, hey, we need a new thing. And it needs to do this, and it needs to call the API, and it needs to be up 99.95% of the time. And oh, by the way, I want it to be secure. So when your team gets to that, and they start making the decisions about whether do I put in security or do I put in functionality, how do I actually assess those type of things? And how do I deal with those at my team level for the sense? So this is me. I've done things. I have a doctorate. I wrote a book. I work for BrainGoo right now as their engineering ops, managing their day 2 developer experience, making sure the customers have a good time with the platform we give them. But enough about me, onto the talk. So what do we do? What is the talk about? We've analyzed or summarized 2 years of work on a PhD study to get the previous doctorate, because I wanted to find out what motivated those teams. When we work with teams, how do those teams make those decisions about security within their deliveries? Are they doing them as a separate function, or are they doing it independently? Do they consider whether it's security or a function, or do those just get rounded together? So how do we improve the knowledge about those value experiences? We all hear the value stream, and we hear the end of the day, and we know what the value means to the business. But how are we making those decisions to the team to make sure those lower level decisions in those little blocks we see on the diagram actually match up together? So the research question here was, how do those DevOps practitioners, because I see DevOps as a culture, you commit to flow, feedback, and improvement, you've made a mindset change, you're committed to those things overall and committed with those within a team. How do you experience that association and that exchange of value during your software development practices? We prioritize, but when we do one thing versus the other, how do we talk about those prioritizations? How do we work those things together to find both a security and a functional outcome? How do we wrap those things together in the best process? So as we start, why do we look at this area? Why do I care? Well, obviously I care because I want secure apps, I want functional apps, and I want the user to have the best experience possible. There's really a lack of understanding about some of these value exchange experiences. We see it at that high-level value stream coding, and we see it as we talk about business value, but we don't always get down to that team level to talk to the developers, the people who actually make the day-to-day decisions, the people who have to integrate that value into their processes as they drive forward. There's a lot of lack of literature on those value decisions. We see a lot of high-value discussions. This tool is better for you. This tool will make it better. This tool will make your process better. Or we see the organizational level. We've done an agile transformation. It took us 6 months, 2 years, 4 years. But the agile transformation made our business better. And it misses out on that middle level of what the developers are doing, what the people are experiencing, not the tools they picked, but how do they get that value into the overall process and into the overall stream. So we start with any good research about theories and assumptions, right? And the research areas for this are security governance. What are the practices we use to govern security? How do we govern security? How do we make it happen? How do we create value within those streams for those apps? And how do we do our functional software development? What is the process? Well, look, I went back to a crusty old German philosopher, because most of the German philosophers are crusty and old at this point. And it's amazing how often you go in the past, like the talk we saw yesterday on Stoicism, and find out someone's actually thought about those things 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and those same discussions apply today. Well, the first up there is Heidegger, and this was his phenomenology experience, which is a great word. You can drop it into a conversation. You can say phenomenology, and people look at you like you're crazy, which I had happen quite a bit. But it's actually a very simple thing when you break it off of that. It's to the things themselves. It says we have a thing, we experience that thing. When we have a hammer, we talk about the hammer as a hammer, but does the hammer have a function outside of being a hammer? Because the purpose of that hammer is to drive nails. Is it something outside of that? Do we experience it as something else? If I'm using the hammer to weight the lamp so that it gets the right light angle on my bed, I'm not using the hammer as a hammer, so I have a different experience of that thing as it goes forward. In this, as we did the research, I looked at 3 different areas of those research. I looked at the experience of the world as it's brought to you. When you join a team, when you join a company, they tell you, this is the way things are. This is our corporate standards, this is our methodology, this is the way we go forward. And you take all that in. And then you go back to your team, and you make a separate set of decisions. You have a team working agreement, you have a team acknowledgement, and our team is gonna move forward on this individually. And then because we're DevOps individuals, we have our own approach. I've said, I'm sure a lot of people have said, well, I really wanna do it this way, but the team said we're gonna do it this way, and although I don't agree, I'm gonna move forward. So what individual value compromises have I made as I move forward into that step? In some of those, in the philosophy, as I said, Heidegger with phenomenology and thinking about thinking, and the other one is George Homans, who did social exchange. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit more because I find them interesting. And I'm sorry if you don't, but I've got the mic right now, so I can talk a little bit. George Homans was an American business guy between 1910 and 1989. He's the founder of behavioral sociology in the US, especially as it applies to organizations. He had 2 basic premises, the first being the basic principles of social science must be true as members of the individuals of the human species, not as that particular group. So that anything you take as a group must also be applicable to you as a human. If you take something and the group says you have to do something, but it doesn't apply to you personally, it's very difficult to make that comparison, to make that compromise of your personal values that you have to agree what something has come forward with, even though it's not really a member. And then the second was, any generalizations or facts will be applicable to those principles, right? I can generalize them along. If I can find out how the individuals behave, that individual behavior drives their behavior as a group, which then drives their behavior as a culture, and then that can apply back to the individual, hopefully. The most important one here is when we talk about social exchange, which is that material and non-material items can exchange value. This happens for you when you go into your team and you say, I really need you to do this segment of code for me, and look, I brought you a coffee. Right? You're giving them something of value, you're exchanging it for something else of value. We take that same principle, we expand it to security versus function. How do I consider the value of a functional item versus the value of a security item, and how do I deal with those in my exchange so what gets done and what gets done in any order? Any item in an organization can be exchanged because it has value to someone. The question is, how much value does it have to you, and how much are you willing to exchange it for? These functionality and security concepts have value in our DevOps process, in our development process, and we use kind of that cost versus benefits model to get to those next steps of what those are and get how those drive us to the next process. Well, once we have a social exchange model, we have to think about how we think about it, right? This is Heidegger, that crusty old German philosopher, wrote a book called Zeit und Sein, which is being in time. Very dense, difficult to get through, but a great read. He says, if being is predicted in manifold meanings, what is the fundamental meaning? What am I actually talking about when I'm talking about the hammer? Am I talking about the hammer as a tool, which is separate from myself? Or am I talking about that I'm a builder, so therefore the hammer is valuable to me as a tool as I go forward? And that all of these things are rooted in temporality because they're not just the hammer forever. They're the hammer at a point in time that I need to experience at a point in time. I need to deliver by a certain date. I need to have the code completed within the sprint cycle. So how do I match those things up to what I'm doing to orient myself to the potential or the possibility? I have a great app, but there's no security to it. But it's great. It brings in all the users, but it just broadcasts their names all over the place, right? I don't want that. So we consider the the P word, advancement to the things themselves, right? It moved from a transcendental, which was an earlier philosophy, which is kind of everything has meaning and everything has meaning to everyone, therefore we'll take everything, to a how do I work that through a cycle? How do I start with the meaning it has to me and broaden that out to the culture? That individual's worldview was something he called the scene. And your individual worldview manages how you interact with others. Every time you have a conversation with someone, every time you do paired programming, you're having an interaction with them where you're exchanging things of value and you're exchanging meaning along the process. That gives you that you have parts of it, you have the whole concept of it. Do I have the code itself, or do I have just the element of the code? How do I get a deeper understanding? One of the other great parts about Heidegger looking at this is that his technological view is that man orders technology, or humans order technology, and then is that ordered by it. We build a thing to do something for us, and then later our life is shaped by the way we do our thing. If you need an example, look at your phone. We needed a phone, we needed better communication. The phone that was in the house turned to an iPhone that's in your pocket, turned to a supercomputer that you carry everywhere, and then we build ways that can make our life better to shape the technology after the technology has shaped us, that we expect to have it all the time. He also said that there was an inframing, or a process of revealing, uncovering ourselves through the use of technology. We see this all the time in code. Different coders code in different ways. They code in different styles. And that coding uncovers the technology, but it also uncovers us and our experience of that thing. So in DevOps, each participant brings in their cultural view of DevOps, what it means to them from a flow of feedback and continuous improvement, how they've approached it, what that organizational standard is, and what their past experience have been that drive the new interaction and experimentation. I got burned in that in the past when I didn't put that security app in, so now I'm gonna put it in every time, regardless of whether it improves the overall function, because I got burned in the past and I don't want that to happen again. So with that said, it's kind of the basis, kind of the research format for what's going on. What did I actually do to talk to people? How did I find research that would support this type of view? Because you can go out and say it, I can take my personal views, but there's some research that goes behind that. So I found 13 DevOps people. I only needed 10, but I asked for volunteers from our company, selected by their interest through a corporate Slack model. Each of these people had worked in DevOps, and they had a minimum of 3 years of experience. I didn't want people who were brand new, who were just coming in. And it turned out that the average time was actually 9 years of experience with DevOps, which is as long as DevOps have been around. If we go back to 2011, maybe a little bit less than that. And the longest time they had worked for a single organization, because that organizational has serious impacts on how you view DevOps, was 5 years. So some good experience from that process. Each of those individuals went through a 3-interview cycle. I recorded and transcribed the interviews, uploaded them to a tool called NVivo, which is a qualitative analysis tool, which allows you to do themes and stuff. And I also, along the way, used a researcher journaling to remove bias. Every question I asked someone else, I asked myself. And I wrote down what it was and figured out where my individual bias was, that I wanted a different answer, or I was slated to answer it in one particular way versus a different way, so that I could make sure that I knew that I was getting the right answer from them and not just laying my views, my experience, on top of what they were telling me. So at that start, that first cycle of interviews, we talked about their external experiences. How does the world affect you? When you come into a team, how do those standards, how do those governance practices of what has to happen in function security model you? Once we got those questions in, I went to a cycle 2 and I said, we're gonna talk about presence. Now we're gonna talk about how your team addresses those issues. So we know you have these standards at the world level. Now we're talking about your team level. And the third view was individually. Are your individual views different or the same as what you're expressing as a team model as you go forward? Each cycle included open-ended questions, included them the opportunity to come back and tell me I was completely off base, that I was in the wrong area, that I hadn't asked a question they thought was important, or that they had a relevant story or experience that they wanted to share. And being qualitative, it was focused on those open-ended experiences. It wasn't answer a question, give me your answer 1 to 5. It was tell me about an experience you had with security where it worked. Tell me about one you had where it failed. Tell me one where you thought the function was impeded by the security tooling that you had to put in place, or that the security tooling was impeded because I needed a function before I needed security. After we did that analysis, we collected all those interviews. I read them, I anonymized them so that nobody knew what they were talking about, or that I didn't know who they were talking about, the reader didn't know who they were talking about, so that their name would not show up later on. I coded them based on the various things I was looking for, that world, that presence, interaction, and readiness. And I used a chart kind of like this, and we'll see some time warp diagrams of this later on, where I could map their answers. I could see who answered in what area and what they answered about as they were coded. We did identify some themes as we went through 3 rounds of interviews. We found, first off, there were DevOps issues that they had. And the DevOps issue is passivity, that they felt even though they were committed to DevOps, they didn't feel a strong need to express that to other people. They knew what it was, therefore I don't have to tell anyone else what it is. We're just gonna go ahead and do the thing. That the culture was different as they went from different organizations and different groups, that even though they all said they were DevOps, there was not an underlying fundamental understanding. That it varied from place to place and from action to action. And that they preferred solutions, right? Every DevOps team prefers a solutional goal. They wanted to have solutions, they didn't want to have problems. And this ties into that last theme there of technological preference. Every DevOps team and every member I interviewed, and most people from a gut feel, prefer to have a technological solution to a problem as opposed to a process solution. I want to put in an automated test. I don't want to have to go down the road to Bob or to Jane and say, hey, this is the problem. We need to do this and this to solve it. We want to have a technological means to solve that thing. We also saw a lot of management conflict. There was a lot of external management conflict. What the management wants you to do is not in line with the best solution from your DevOps practice, is not in line with the best thing that you can do to move forward. And with that, with those management conflicts, we got a lot of confusion, that things weren't clearly expressed, or when they were clearly expressed, there wasn't a lot of meaning behind what it was. The program manager, the boss comes in and says, hey, I need a Kubernetes application, and it needs to be running ambient from solo, and it needs to function in this manner, and they laid on all these technological specifications that didn't make sense for what they were delivering at the time. And then, of course, at the end, if they add, oh, and by the way, it needs to have security, it caused even more issues. So what does it look like? I apologize, these are the time warp diagrams. I'll show one of each just so I show I coded it, and it's more for an informational basis than anything else. But after getting all those responses, I grouped them together. The size of the dot shows how many responses I got that I felt were in that area once I coded, and the different colors show the different questions I asked along the way. We split it into that value section of how do you view this as a value, how do you view it as a function, and how do you view it as security. And then I split them into the DevOps over on the side of how many of these questions reflected a DevOps answer. Those two big circles you see here are, have you worked in DevOps before, and how long have you worked in DevOps, right? Those are not the open-ended, but they were the framing questions to get us into the rest of the conversation. Then we did a round two, and as you see, the questions when you get to a team start spreading out more. We don't get as many answers in the same spot. We kind of get a variety of team things. Even though they were working for teams, they had a more disparate view of what they were seeing as a team. And then when we go back to round three, talking about how do you feel individually, they tend to group more together. We get more of those answers to the people who are answering them in a group. They're answering from value, from their perspective, from their internal prospect of what goes forward. And one of the great things is you see is over in that right-hand column is a DevOps personal, that they viewed a lot of these DevOps concepts internally. Most of the people we talked to had internalized the concepts and viewed any other questions they were getting through that lens, which is important to us as a DevOps culture and a DevOps process. So what does it mean? We've gone through a lot of structuring the research and moving forward to the next step. Well, answering that first question, we said, how do the DevOps practitioners as a culture experience associating and exchanging value? Well, we find that social exchange for value doesn't take place regularly as part of the DevOps culture. Although we prioritize things, we are prioritizing a lot of them times on weigh the shortest job first or those types of approaches, as opposed to what value that thing has to the team or what value that has overall. The DevOps culture holds a different standard of value than the customer. Where the customer says this is the value and this is the business value, almost every time the DevOps value is how quickly can I get that delivered. My best value proposition is that I can do that thing fast. I can keep that stream of delivery. Leading in one case to a quote, because sometimes when you interview individuals, you find great quotes that are better than anything you can come up with, was the slow trickle of expected capability that leads to half-baked functionality that the customer doesn't realize is half-baked. As long as I can put something in their hands now, they'll be happy, regardless of how close or how much that advances them to the actual goal, because that they feel they're advancing, whether it's a step or 1,000 steps to reach that next one. One of the other important things realizing this, which if it had come to me at the start, it would have been a different research question, was that security was viewed as a subset of functionality. The teams didn't separate the security functions or security and a functional delivery, but they saw them as the same, because I can't have security without a function. Unless I have an API call to go out and do something, it doesn't make sense to secure that API call if I don't have any API calls. So I have to have that function first. I have to drive to that function first to get the next answer. And then, of course, we found that communications in those teams tends to be hampered by unclear and restricted channels. Program managers are too far away, bosses are too far away, the customer's too far away from what we have to deliver. And although we try to move that out, we try to get closer focus on the customer, closer focus on the user, it doesn't always happen. So sometimes we found the leader is so far removed from setting priorities that the team would just double down on what they thought was the appropriate process to move forward, right? They're delivering on that time-based function again. I'm delivering something in a timely manner rather than necessarily delivering the best thing. So what does that lead to? DevOps culture does not inherently consider the exchange of security and functionality for project value. Our value is based on what we do fastest and what we can deliver consistently over a period of time. How do we get to that CI/CD model, not how we do something different as security and functionality? This was great for me, and it was also interesting because you get a lot of those decisions. You talk to a lot of customers for the first time. They say they want a new app, and they talk about function and security as different items. But by the time it hits the team, security and function are not different items. They are the same item. We correlate those security and functionality rather than the individual concern about those things. They become grouped together as part of the product. A value difference that we have in the team will be recognized. That's not quite the value the customer wants. That's not quite the way it was expressed to drive forward, but it's not challenged by the team because their value is back to that timeliness metric. As long as I can deliver something, I will continue to increase the overall value, even though if it's not quite the precise value. Any of those timely deliveries create a DevOps value for me as a team. They create an experience that I can benefit and value myself because I know I met the timelines, I know I met the functions, and I know I drove forward effectively through that model. So what are recommendations, right? We did research, analyzed it all, wrote up a big status, wrote up a big paper, brought all that stuff in together. Well, we need to be able to align clear values between management and development teams. When these are separated, we get too much disconnect between what we're going to deliver. And as you saw, if we have that disconnect, we just double down on what we think is appropriate rather than maybe moving to that next step. We need to have precise goals, but not precise methods. I need a function that does a thing, not a function that does a thing with Kubernetes and zero trust in this model using this other container and this party software and this connection. Those can happen, but when those are expressed first, they restrict your ability to get to that timely delivery, and they restrict your ability to deliver it first. We do, however, continue the security emphasis because most of the developers were willing to take security as a key factor, and they did consider security in their practices. They just didn't consider it separate. It was all part of that inherent delivery that we're doing. If we're building something, it's going to be secure. It's going to have these restrictions. Our secrets are all going to be encrypted as opposed to open on GitHub or for someone else. And then, as always, because we're at a conference and we're communicating, the stress was on continual communication. That once a quarter or once a cycle is not enough, but there has to be that continual back and forth between the higher levels down to the team, internal to the team, and between the individuals in the team to find the right things for them. So where would that lead for future research? I did a group with a group of individuals in my company. I think the results are fairly accurate. I think they're applicable based on my own knowledge of DevOps. But you could do different groups within different companies and find out if those different organizations impacted it. You could run a DevOps cultural group across multiple companies. I'm a member of the DevOps Institute group. They do a lot of ambassador functions. They do a lot of other functions, but you have a DevOps group where you have individuals that subset multiple companies. Or at a conference like this, where we have DevOpsDays, people representing DevOps from a number of different companies, where your experience of DevOps might be different than another individual's. So how do we correlate those? Or how do we find if we have the same answers overall? And then, of course, how would we go in and measure the functionality of those expectations? We were looking at just from the individual perspective and from the DevOps team perspective, but how do we measure what they've actually delivered against the quality of the value that hits the other end? How does the project manager, the business leader, see that value that's coming to them as a timely manner, regardless of whether it addresses function or security? So I'm ahead because I talk fast, which means I have time for questions. If anybody asks questions. I do have them as an attachment to the paper in the dissertation. I can get them to you if you want to email me. But yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Well, if you do, you can get a hold of me there. And thanks for letting me present at DevOps Days Detroit. I've greatly enjoyed it.